In this video, I want to take a look at a noise that's coming from the engine. It's kind of a grinding, hissing noise that is most likely coming from this power steering pump. We're now going to take a look at removing the power steering pump from the engine and servicing it to get rid of that noise, which is also known as cavitation. We're going to explain more about this in the process of disassembling the power steering hydraulic pump and removing it from the engine itself. This is how you're going to know when you need to service the oil. Simply going to take your finger when the engine is cool and so is the oil. You're going to stick it in there. You're going to lift it out. You're going to look at your fingers and the oil that's dripping off, and you can see this is very, very clean. So this proves that we have serviced this system recently. In your case, your finger is probably going to be all looking like dirt, contaminations. Basically going to look something close to that hose. It's going to be all black and this color. So that's a sign of contamination, and you're going to need to replace the oil and continue to do what we are going to show you in this video. Before we can subject ourselves to any work or performance on this engine, we must first let the engine come to a cool temperature, and we will notice by feeling the radiator hose. Very important that the radiator and its coolant system is absolutely cool. Once you have this tension in the hose, you will not be able to operate on the engine or perform any repair. We must wait until the system is cool so this hose can be pressed where the two sides collapse and touches each other. At this point, with the radiator hot, you do not want to open the radiator cap. This is going to cause water to spew out of the radiator, spill out of the radiator, and most likely burn you in the face, on the hands, on the shoulder. So we're going to wait for the vehicle to cool. Then we're going to remove the cap for the power steering reservoir. We want to make sure we inspect the fluid. The fluid must be absolutely clean, and I will post a link in the video description to show how to flush this power steering. Next step is we want to make sure we remove the positive or the negative battery cable. We have already completed a fluid service on this power steering hydraulic system by replacing the oil at around 100,000 miles. Most likely in your case, the power steering oil will have a dark or black color discoloration. This is a sign of contamination inside of the oil, and this contamination can affect seal on the power steering rack and pinion or its gearbox. It will also affect the seal inside the hydraulic power steering pump, which is what we're going to be removing. We also want to look for a blockage in the passageway to and from the power steering pump and its rack and pinion or gearbox. Any blockage or restriction in the system will cause a noise or a grinding sound from the power steering while the engine is idling or during the period of driving and coasting on the highway. You must first take a close look at the power steering pump itself and observe its high pressure hose, which has a sensor on it, and its low pressure hose. We also must inspect the power steering serpentine belt and its drive system with the pulley and bearing. You could look in the video description for a link on how to identify these faulty bearing and belt drive system. As we can see, on the back of this power steering belt is starting to peel away. This is a sign of deterioration and dry rot to the rubber of the belt. It's also a sign that the belt might need replacement. But we will have to completely remove that belt to inspect its reverse side, which is the serpentine groove side, for cracks and missing serpentine. With the power steering hydraulic pump serpentine belt removed with a 14mm 6.38 drive socket, we can now inspect the belt on the serpentine groove area for any cracks or missing grooves. Any cracks or missing groove will mean that we need to replace the belt. We also want to flip the belt around like this and take a close look. while we move it all around. We want to look at all the surface on the belt, make sure we notice no cracks. We want to do it all around the corners, making sure we have a perfect belt. You can click on the link in the video description to see how to remove this belt. The next thing we want to inspect is the water pump pulley and its bearing. We simply want to rotate it by hand, listening for any growling or any noise. We also want to take a look at the power steering pulley tensioner. We want to do the same thing we did with the water pump with the tensioner pulley. We just want to spin it, rotate it by hand, making sure that we have a smooth rotation, no growling or noise from the bearing. We will also do the same thing with the power steering hydraulic pump pulley. We want to rotate it, making sure it has a smooth rotation. When we remove this pump, we're going to inspect the seal for any oil leak, which is not apparently currently. So if the power steering belt continue to squeak and you have a good belt, a brand new belt, and when you replace it, it still seems to squeak on the pulley, chances are the pulley might be worn out or defective and might need replacing. With a catch can below the vehicle under the power steering pump, we can now proceed to removing its hoses. So before we remove the hose, we want to make sure we just bring this clamp up off the spout. Then we're just going to twist it. Sometimes it's going to be tight on there, so you're going to have to twist it. And you're just going to pull it up, letting all the fluid pour down into the catch can below. So we're going to leave this here for now. And then we're going to proceed to the high pressure hose. This hose, sometime you're going to have to replace, and its sensor, so it's going to have to be disconnected from the pump, and it travels its way all the way to the gearbox, the steering box. In the video description, there's a link on how to replace the seal for the steering gearbox on this vehicle. Okay, so when you remove this bolt for the high pressure line, there's going to be two washers, one that sits on the top and one sit below. So you have to make sure you retrieve those two washers. This is one and that's two. So we're going to keep these two together. When you're going to be replacing this line, you're going to need to use new copper washer. It is ideal and best to do so. Alright, now we must take this end of the line and make sure it's completely empty with fluid. We must not forget to disconnect the power steering pressure sensor. Then we just want to put this hose to the side. Same thing we want to do with the low pressure hose. 24 millimeter 6-point socket. You don't want to use a 12-point. With a 1/2 inch extension and ratchet to remove this bolt from the power steering high pressure line. So I just want to replace this bolt with the two washer into the pump because I don't want any contamination to enter inside of the pump, and I also don't want to damage the threads on the bolt and on the inside fixture. Now it's time for us to detach the power steering hydraulic pump from its bracket. And the way we're going to do this is you're going to notice right here there is a bolt that extends through the bracket onto the pump. We have to remove this bolt, and directly on the opposite side of this bolt is another one identical to it that's going to need to get removed. To ease the pressure of removing the bolt from the power steering pump, we will first need to remove this bolt that retains the lower radiator hose. Bolt is a 12 millimeter. Now we could move this hose out of the way to gain access for the bolts. Alright, so we're going to use the same 12 millimeter with our ratchet. Once you have the bolt on tighten, you're going to use a long 12mm socket, and you're just going to reach in there between the pulley and the nut, and you're going to be able to take the nut completely out of position. These are the two bolts that were removed from the power steering pump. That's from the front face of the pulley. Once these two bolts has been removed, we're going to have one more bolt to remove, and that will be in that location where that 14mm socket is installed. This is a long 14mm. So you're going to have to get at that from below with the ratchet hanging down, and then you're going to have to turn it like this. When you remove this bolt, this is the 14mm. See how long it is? When you're going to be taking this bolt out, this bracket here is what's going to be on the back. It's basically, you can see how it positions itself. So this is going to fall down on the rock guard. So you're going to hear this noise when it falls down on the rock guard. So this is how the bolt and its nut is assembled when it's in the power steering pump. You have to remember this. You're going to see how we're going to install the pump to replace this. We have the whole pump completely moved. So what we want to do now is we want to take our pry bar. We just want to place it in between the pump and its bracket, and we want to see if we can pry it away. So we're going to have to try another tool. So you're going to be able to remove this pump by moving that hose out of the way, and you're going to be able to pull it right up from above. But this is what we want. So here you can see our 3 bolts. That's 1, 2, 3. So we have a 12, 12, and a 14mm. This is the back of the pump. This is where we have to disconnect. But first we have to clean it before we could go inside and perform our inspection.